Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Harnessing Resilience Strategies to Thrive. I'm Ginger Roberts Scott. You are at a WIC Lunch and Learn, and it is being recorded. Please mute your microphone if you're not speaking. If you have questions, you can put them in the chat. You can raise your hand. Sam and I are monitoring the chat, and Delvina, who is the speaker, won't be able to see the chat, but we will share with her. And so first I want to introduce you to Delvina. Dr. Delvina Miremadi-Baldino is the Resilience Strategy and Impact Director at the Maine Resilience Building Network, a public health nonprofit in Maine. And most of the time, those folks are the ones behind our Lunch and Learns. Dr. Miremadi-Baldino is a resilience specialist and behavioral health change agent and demonstrates this through research, education, program development, and entrepreneurship. Prior to this, Dr. Miremadi-Baldino worked as the Director of Research and Program Development at Life Advantages, developing innovative online resources to enhance well-being. She also worked for Children's Hospital of Boston's development of psychiatry, supporting communities and schools in their efforts to prevent youth depression and suicide. She received her EDM from Harvard University in Human Development and Psychology, completed her doctorate in educational leadership at Simmons University, and most recently obtained a certificate in positive psychology from the University of Pennsylvania. Dr. Miremadi-Baldino is a certified positive psychology practitioner, CAP, certified positive educator, and certified coach. Among other qualifications, she is trained in mindfulness in the classroom, as well as trauma-informed yoga for children and teens. Her extensive training in education and psychology places her at the forefront of supporting children, families, organizations, and communities to promote resilience and enhance mental health. So today, she is going to talk to us about navigating the professional and personal challenges of life that can be particularly hard on individuals' mental well-being. In addition to the normal pressures of balancing work and family life, we have all faced unprecedented challenges, uncertainty, and stress over the last 3 years. During this webinar, we will explore evidence-based strategies to bring more awareness and equanimity to the chaos of everyday life. We will uncover powerful approaches to shift your mindset, promote well-being, and learn practices that can help you pave a more positive and thriving path forward. The learning objectives today. Participants will examine the current challenges and stresses you face and how that impacts your well-being. Participants will learn how the science of positive psychology can foster your capacity for resilience and buffer against these risk factors. Participants will explore how to harness specific evidence based in resilient strategies in your daily life to support well-being and promote a thriving life. And then, Sam, if I'm right, contact your supervisor for your CEUs. They're going to send a list into Sam, and we'll send you back your credits. Correct, Sam?
Yes, and your attendance, please.
Yes, awesome. So, Delvina, without further delay, please take it away. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. I'm gonna have to shorten that bio. That was quite a mouthful. Sorry about that. Welcome, everyone. I'm happy to share in this hour with you. I know you guys are having lunch, so just relax and engage as necessary. I welcome any questions throughout the presentation. If something pops into your head or anything comes up for you, please feel free to type it in the chat, and we'll do our best to address them. And then at the end, also, I'll make sure we have time for questions. I also want to just acknowledge that we're going to be talking about stressors in your life. We're going to be providing, as many coping skills and self-care strategies as possible. But if anything should come up for you, please do what you need to step away or take care of yourself if anything does come up along the way. The introduction really did a a wonderful job of just kind of talking about what we're going to be covering today. So I'm here from the Maine Resilience Building Network, as I know many of you are familiar with through past workshops and trainings. And we're happy to be here to really support you in your ongoing work and the amazing work that you're doing every day. So again, just kind of, we're going to be looking at the science of stress, how it impacts us, and then we're going to utilize the science of positive psychology and resilience to really think about how do we begin to implement strategies that can help mitigate the effects of that stress on our minds, on our bodies, on our, lifestyle, and so on and so forth. So just to kind of ground us all, I know many of us have felt like this, and especially in the work that you do, right? The change, the uncertainty, as was mentioned a few minutes ago, someone may be walking into your office for something in particular, but may have many other challenges that need to be addressed that could not have been kind of planned for or predicted. And so really that ongoing process of change and uncertainty, and the way in which our bodies kind of register change is through our stress response. And so because our brains love certainty and kind of patterns, right? Information, anytime something is uncertain or comes up, unpredictably, or, creates some uncertainty, that our brain and body kind of triggers that stress response. So just keeping that in mind, that there is inevitably a lot of stress, and those stressors themselves might not be something that you can control. However, there are things that we can do to mitigate the impact of that stress. And so that's really what we're focusing on today, not the stressors, but our own stress response, and then how we can learn to kind of work with that and have strategies to help us through that. This quote, the expectation that we can be immersed in suffering and loss daily and not be touched by it is as unrealistic as expecting to be able to walk through water without getting wet. The work you guys do is really hard. It's, trying, and it includes a lot of what may be, traumatic stories, experiences of others. And so through those interactions are, experiencing that, what we consider to be kind of vicarious trauma, right? Kind of secondhand, and that you're going to carry that, even though it's part of your job, and you leave and go home to your families, or, where you live, what you learned, heard, saw, that day, right, is carried in your body. And so we need to really think about ways in which we can intentionally process that through our bodies and our minds. And so that's really what we're doing today, is really thinking about the impact of all these experiences, whether it's at home, community, professional, that there are lots of ways in which stress impact can happen. But again, we're really thinking about that. However, understanding that it really is for us to think about, how do we sustain when we're under this stress? What do we do to address the cumulative impact, right? Or the overwhelm that we feel. So thinking before we move into learning some of these new strategies, what do you do already? What works for you, right? And keeping that in mind throughout, because if you have different, strategies that are already working, then we want to just add more to that toolbox, right? We don't want to replace those. Also, maybe things work for a little while and then maybe they stop working. So maybe you continue to do what you're already doing, but you keep some of these strategies in that toolbox for, a time and place when you need it in the future. we're going to be really intentional. So I talked about, the stressor is different than the stress that we feel in our body, our response, right? And that's the impact. That's the stress impact that we're talking about, how it shows up in our own, kind of personal life and professional life. And that there are intentional things that we need to do in order to mitigate that. And so thinking about, how does stress show up for you? When you feel overwhelmed, right? How is it kind of impacting maybe you're more short-tempered with or less patient with your kids? Maybe you feel, tension in your shoulders or knots in your, in your shoulder blades. I say that because that's certainly one that shows up for me. But just thinking about, what are the different ways for you, and then professionally, right? Maybe you withdraw, maybe you get, exhausted and just can't show up to perform or do, the things that are expected to meet certain deadlines per se. So just having that understanding of how it shows up, especially in your body and in your behaviors. Oftentimes, because of how our brains are wired, right, when we're in that threat response, we actually lose access to kind of our rational brain, our memory-making, problem-solving brain, or memory. And so when that amygdala, that threat response, that stress part of our brain is triggered, we are going to be less likely to be able to recognize, acknowledge, and make sense of the stress that is occurring in that moment. And because of us, we're going to feel all of these things in our body before we can actually say, wow, I'm really feeling stressed about A or B or C. And so getting in tune with what is your kind of natural response to stress, where it lives in your body and your emotions and your, how it shows up in your behaviors, is going to be really important for identifying and be able to kind of take action, right? These intentional strategies earlier, not waiting until you're able to kind of think about what you're stressed about necessarily, right? Because that shows up often much later down the path of your stress response because of what's happening in your brain. We know that when we look at, adverse childhood experiences, traumatic experiences, that it impacts and accumulates over time in our body, and that lasts well beyond childhood, right? So thinking about how these may be playing a role in the current stressors that you're experiencing, how that's showing up with, the people that you're working with, and just keeping in mind that trauma and stress does affect our brain, and it does affect kind of our body. So we know, I mean, you guys are very familiar, I'm sure, with the ACEs and how that can really disrupt our kind of normal brain development. It makes us more hyper aware. So it creates a nervous system that's going to be more reactive to stressful situations. And so, I share this just to kind of keep in mind what is going on in your nervous system as you're kind of getting familiar. Also, just keep in mind the past experiences you've had, how that may have kind of created changes in your brain and in your ability to regulate, and how that's playing a role, but also knowing that there are things that we can do to really support our resilience and well-being moving forward. And that is the intentional practices and strategies we're going to talk about today that have been proven to help us rewire our brain and actually create a nervous system that is less reactive And so we'll talk about that a little bit more, but just knowing kind of what is done can be undone, right? Because of the neuroplasticity in our brain. And so that really is the intentional effort that we're putting in. And so as part of that, right, just again, resetting that nervous system, we want to kind of counterbalance the chemical reactions that happen during our stress response. That these strategies are especially effective at helping kind of dopamine increase, which helps us feel safe. So things like laughing and exercise and mindfulness activities, right? These are all opportunities to really change that nervous system chemical release and increase the feel-good hormones that counterbalance that. And again, while you're doing them, they also really help to rewire the brain. So really, when I say intentional strategies, the reason I keep saying that kind of over and over again is really because I want you to think about, the pathways in your brain that have been practiced, right? That may be exasperating your stress. So ways of thinking that, are more pessimistic, or reactivity as opposed to being responsive, that there are these certain ways in which our stress response has kind of wired us to react in these special stressful situations. Those pathways in the brain, because they've been practiced many times, are going to be stronger. And so we're not only creating new pathways, but then we want to practice them. And so the strategies we're talking about today are really about just little things that you can do every day that are going to help to create a brain that is capable of responding to stress in a more resilient way, which is really our ultimate goal. Oops, sorry about that. So we're really looking at, in the activation part of stress, right? How can we find ways to regulate our nervous system, then kind of reframe how we're thinking about it and move into this place of connecting, and that these strategies are what ultimately are going to lead to us being more resilient. So just to get on the same page in terms of what we're talking about when we're saying resilient, right? It's a word that is talked about a lot more recently, especially, given the pandemic. And so it is something, though, that's been around for a long time. There's a lot of research. Originally, the literature was really looking at twin studies and thinking that there is a particular characteristic or a character trait that certain individuals have, they're born with it, and others don't, in terms of being resilient. But what they found was that is actually not true, that it is just ordinary magic, this idea that we all have the capacity to be resilient. And in fact, it is something that can be learned and supported over time. And that there are factors, not just within the individual, but also in our work environments, our communities, our families, that do contribute to our resilience. So we want to think about it as both internal and external factors that we can intentionally engage with in order to be more resilient. Chris Peterson is a prominent positive psychologist, and he talks about resilience as struggling well, which I love that definition, because oftentimes I think there's a misconception that if you're resilient, you're kind of able to skip your way through everyday life. Challenges aren't a big deal. But that's not really the human experience, right? So being resilient doesn't mean you're not going to struggle. It doesn't mean you're not going to have difficult emotions. And when hard things happen, you're going to feel, the impact of that. However, you have this kind of safety net or this toolbox that during those times of struggle, you have the capacity to implement in these intentional strategies that help shorten the duration of that struggle and hopefully help kind of you feel less suffering in that struggle, right? So you may not suffer as much, right? You're able to kind of get through it. And the science is really coming from this field of positive psychology. So, you know, when we think about psychology, we often think about clinical psychology, right? What's wrong with people, all of the research that we have to diagnose and treat people, which is a wonderful thing. And that really gets us back to zero. But when we're talking about being resilient, right? If we can implement strategies that move us further from 0 to +5, right? To this flourishing, then when the hard things happen, we may fall back a little, say you're at +4, maybe you go down to +2, but you're still not in this complete, suffering place of burnout and overwhelm and anxiety and depression, right? You're still in this healthier place. And so really we're taking that science that is in this field of what's right with people and finding ways to implement it in our everyday life to help move us further along that continuum in everyday life. And again, similarly, it's kind of looked at and talked about in this way, right? That the more kind of cumulative impact of these positive experiences, these coping skills, these kind of intentional practices, the more we have, not only do we tip the scale, but we can move that fulcrum further. So the impact of the stressors, right? You kind of need a lot more in order to tip the scale back. So that's how we're framing today, how we're thinking about, the impact of the everyday stressors you guys, encounter, as well as how we're looking at resilience and where this science is coming from. And so we're going to do that with kind of these 3 R's of resilience. So relax, reframe, and reconnect. And if you remember kind of that stress, right? Bell curve, sorry, I'm like, what is that word? We want to really think about when we are experiencing this stressful situation, right? We can have a more resilient response by starting with how we relax, then how we're thinking about it, and then most importantly, right, what are kind of the support systems we have in place that can help us kind of create that foundation of resilience and give us an opportunity to reach out if we need it. So sometimes the most productive thing we can do, right, is to relax. And again, that's really coming from the place of, as I mentioned, that when we are in this stress state, we do not have access to the parts of our brain that are going to help us problem solve, be productive, right, do all the things that we want to do, respond thoughtfully and rationally. We're just being really reactive. And in addition, when it builds over time, it leads to burnout. So we really want to think about our stress as a cycle. And I think thinking about it that way, you can think about, okay, every time my stress system is triggered, that alert system goes off. It could be for any number of reasons, right? Something at work, a phone call you get from, your child at school, something's gone wrong, whatever the external stressor is, what happens physically in your body is the same. That is the trigger of your stress cycle, and it is up to us in many of these situations to complete the cycle by sending the signal to our brain that we are safe and that we can move into rest and recovery in order to then move forward and problem solve, right? Because that system is designed as though a car is coming at us and we jump out of the way before we think about it, right? Our body responds to the event before we can cognitively say, oh, a car is coming at me. I'm going to take my left leg. I'm going to lift it up over the curb. I'm going to lean my body forward and, push off my legs so I can dive out of the way. Our body just does it, right? So take that scenario. We jump out of the way. Our body has kept us, and our brain have kept us safe. What happens next is our nervous system registers that we are now safe. The car has passed. Our body is safe. We got out of the way. And so we go into normal recovery. Now imagine that same nervous system doing exactly the same thing when you get an email, or when a client comes in with bruises on their body, or when you get a phone call about something, that's happened at home or with your children. So it's that same stress response. So again, we need to find ways to trigger that safety so we can operate from a more regulated place in order to address the challenges that are in front of us. And so we want to think about that part of the nervous system that is responsible for our rest and recovery, is that parasympathetic nervous system. And that within that, there is actually a nerve that makes up 75% of that nervous system, called the vagus nerve. And so there are things that we can do to trigger the vagus nerve. And that the vagus nerve system acts to counterbalance the fight or flight system, and it triggers that relaxation response in our body. So it's the longest nerve in our body. It connects your brain to all kinds of important organs. It is also known as a key part of this rest and digest nervous system. And it influences your breathing, your digestive function, your heart rate. All of these, right, have a huge impact then on your mental health. So learning to activate the nervous system tells your brain that you are calm and relaxed. And then because of that, your heart rate will slow down, your respiration, slows down, your blood pressure lowers. And the cool thing about this is that we can utilize this during times of stress. So some easy ways to activate the vagus nerve. One of the best ways is stimulating the vagus nerve through deep, slow belly breathing. And so, this really is a tool that people talk about, okay, you're breathing or take breaths, but you have so much control over your breath, and your breath truly can, do all kinds of things in terms of, physiologically changing what's happening in your digestive system and your nervous system and your, muscles, right? Stiffness, tension. So where we hold all of that anxiety, that fear, that stress in our body, by breathing and by activating the vagus nerve, we really change that. A couple of things to remember when you are doing breathing: in order for it to be a calming breath, you want it to be kind of a slow breath in through your nose into your belly. That's why it's called belly breathing. So if we breathe into our chest, this is the kind of breathing we do during the fight or flight response. So that exaggerates kind of that stress response. So what we want to do is breathe into the belly, deep belly breaths. And then when you breathe out, that's the contraction of the diaphragm that's triggering the vagus nerve. So you want to breathe in, say, for 5, as this, the slide shows, but your exhale, you want to be longer than your inhale. It's the exhale that's going to trigger the nervous system, that part of the nervous system, the parasympathetic rest and digest. So just thinking about, can you do that, 3 times, and feel how in that moment it changes what's happening in your body. Another couple of ways that you can activate the vagus nerve. Something, so kind of, silly as like some kind of repetitive chanting or mantra. The reason for that, and as as demonstrated in like the media, or you've seen kind of that, the reason they do that is because of the vibration that creates in your throat, which is connected to that vagus nerve. So we can utilize that. And affirmation. So we know that kind of repeating something, maybe a single word or a phrase, it helps to detract from your kind of mind wandering, worry thoughts, past thinking, right? And by doing so, it allows for your brain to focus on kind of the healing and this relaxation. So it kind of interrupts that cycle that's exasperating the stress response, and through kind of a distractive mechanism, and then allows you to go into the rest and digest. You know, we always hear exercising reduces stress. We know a lot of it is because of the feel-good hormones, the dopamine that's released during physical activity. Our kind of muscles secrete different hormones into our bloodstream, right, that help reduce stress. But also physical activity triggers that vagus nerve. So that leads to some of the beneficial kind of brain and mental health effects that we see. Studies also show that when your body adjusts to cold, right, your fight or flight system declines and your rest and digest system increases. And this is all kind of mediated by that vagus nerve. So we can do things to kind of utilize that science. For example, drinking a cold glass of water or splashing cold water on your face. It's also been shown that lowering the temperature at the end of your shower for about 30 seconds will, over time, decrease your fight or flight or your kind of sympathetic pathways, meaning that stress response, allowing you to operate in a more kind of regulated way. So something that's interesting about the vagus nerve is there's something called vagal tone. So the more you engage in these practices, you actually can enhance your vagal tone, and a higher vagal tone, and research that looks at people who have a higher vagal tone, their nervous system is basically primed to be less reactive during stressful states. So it's harder for your body's fight or flight kind of stress response to be triggered. It requires more significant events to trigger, as opposed to kind of having a lower vagal tone. Every, little kind of event triggers that threat response. You're kind of more susceptible to that. So again, practicing it not only helps in that moment to bring you to a regular state, but the reason we say practicing is because when you intentionally do these things over time, you create a nervous system that is more resilient and allows you to be more resilient in the face of stress. And then finally, the power of kind of visualization. While it may kind of seem silly or whatever it may be, what we know is your brain believes everything you think. So, for example, if I say, don't think about a donut, whatever you do right now, don't think about a donut. Tell yourself, I'm not going to think about a donut. All you can probably see as you're saying that is the picture of a donut in your mind, because your brain doesn't register don't. So you can't say, I'm not going to stress about this, I'm not going to do that. No, you have to actually put more positive things in place, which allows for visualization. If you're in a really challenging situation, you're feeling the overwhelm and stress of that, to just take a few minutes, put yourself in maybe one of your favorite places or a beautiful place, or use an app to kind of walk you through a visualization exercise where you're really putting yourself in a place that is kind of calming or healing. Your physical body will respond as though you truly are in that place, right? If you're really thinking about that, bringing your senses to it, it actually changes physiologically what is happening. Now we're going to move on to reframing. So we've kind of been able to regulate, complete that stress cycle. And now we want to examine and reframe how we think about the stressors and traumas that we encounter, and using the opportunity of what we are in control of. So we talked a little bit about we can control, right, our breath. We can control that what we do to trigger the nervous system. Another thing we have control over is our thoughts and beliefs. So we often forget that the B, right? We think an event happens and I get, I feel upset, or I'm angry, or there's some kind of consequential behavior or reaction. But there's actually this whole component of our beliefs about ourselves and the world around us that are actually creating that consequential behavior or feeling, right? It's why, you could put 100 people in the same situation and everybody's going to walk away with a different experience, right? Because it's how you process it through your belief systems and these kind of automatic thoughts that create that consequential feeling or behavior. So one of the things that we can do is really look at the science that is coming out of mindfulness. And without even really getting into too much about the practice, right? What we know is it helps us to create some space. Oops, sorry, that's on an automatic thing for some reason. Between what happens, right, those external stressors, and how we respond to them, the C, those consequential feelings and behaviors. And when we can insert mindful practice, right, it helps us to really have a more controlled response, right, to be able to see and the situation and not let our automatic kind of thoughts determine how we move forward, but in fact, have the opportunity in the space to be able to choose how we're going to respond. And just thinking about what happens when we're, engaging in mindful practice, how that relates to being, resilient. We can experience this ability to allow these sensory experiences to kind of come and go without suppressing them or avoiding them, right? So mindfulness is very much about noticing and kind of without over-identifying. So if you have these negative thoughts, if you have these difficult emotions, you're able to kind of have some space for them. Sometimes it's talked about as passing clouds in the sky. Sometimes, I've heard it talked about as you're sitting at the bus stop and you're watching the cars go by and you're just acknowledging the different types of cars, the different colors of the car, the make, the model. You're noticing, but you're not jumping in each car and going for the ride, right? You're just using them as, kind of a passing thought, information, a feeling that you can just acknowledge and let it go. Another thing is kind of this ability to focus on that present moment, what's relevant in that moment. So not getting kind of into the cycle of the past worry, future worry, right? All of these things that either we can't change from the past or, may never happen in the future, these kind of worst case scenarios, and really allowing us to be in the present, which then gives us the relevant information, right? To be able to make choices in how to respond in that moment. And then that kind of ability to keep track of what you're actually experiencing in that moment, that clarity that comes from being more present. And when we look at the research, there's hundreds of studies on adults from the past, 30 plus years. There are more and more studies that are coming out on the benefits for youth, but we really can see that there is just profound impacts on your well-being, your brain, how you interact with the world around you, and overall this kind of nervous system. And so earlier I had mentioned kind of we're doing these things to rewire our brain, right? And we've seen that there is kind of the the impact on the part of the brain, the hippocampus. It's really critical for learning and memory and helps regulate that stress response, right? So the more that's activated, the more there's gray matter density, the better. And we've seen that the hippocampus is more activated and does produce more gray matter density following a mindfulness training. The prefrontal cortex, right? This is associated with our kind of regulating of emotions and our behaviors, making wise, rational decisions. And this part of the brain has also been shown to be more activated and more developed following mindful training. And then the amygdala, right? That is the stress response, that part of the brain that we're talking about that's responsible for that. Our emotions, our fear, that threat response, and that we have seen that there are opportunities to kind of that this part of the brain is less activated following mindfulness training. So what does kind of mindfulness look like in everyday life, right? So a lot of these studies, you know, some of them are 10 minutes, some of them are 20, 30 over the course of the day, but there's also been a lot of research that just is about these mindful moments. And I find that if we think about mindfulness as just how we show up in the moment to our everyday life, right? And so there are lots of opportunities throughout your day to just have a mindful moment that, again, is bringing your attention out of the mind wandering and into the present moment, right? And by doing that, we're strengthening our ability to be present, and we're creating that space between our reaction and being able to have a thoughtful response. So very simple one, just stopping, right? Take a breath and just observing or noticing. Sometimes you can notice what's happening outside of your body. Sometimes you can notice what's happening inside of your body. That's really how I define mindfulness when I'm teaching it to kindergartners, right? Just notice what's happening inside, notice what's happening outside, whether it's sounds and, you know, smells and all the things around you in your space, or it's noticing tension in your body, an itch on your knee, maybe you're thirsty, and then you proceed, but you proceed now with that new knowledge that you have taken in from your observation. So for example, if you notice you're thirsty, instead of, you know, going to do something else, maybe you stop and you go and you get a drink of water. This is really helpful all the way for little kids, but also, you know, especially when we're in high intense kind of workspaces, like the kind of work that you do, that's just continuously moving very quickly. It's asking a lot of you. There isn't a lot of time, right, to do this. However, if you think about, okay, this just takes 30 seconds and I'm going to intentionally create opportunities. Maybe I'm going to stick a stop sign on my computer screen every time I, you know, have to do notes, or I'm going to, you know, put a little stop sign by the hand sanitizer anytime I'm, you know, or washing my hands. I'm going to just do a quick check-in, observe and notice, and then use that information to move forward based on that. Right? It gives us these small moments to really tune in and allow us to not be in that automatic pilot, right? We're just kind of checking in. Another similar way of doing that is asking yourself, you know, am I really washing my hands right now? Am I really eating my lunch right now? And what I mean by that is, are you aware and present and noticing what you're doing in that moment? Or are you, like so many of us typically are, kind of in that mind wandering? And so I use the term mind wandering that comes from research at Harvard University, that 47% of our waking day is spent thinking about something in the past we can't change, or worrying about something in the future that hasn't happened yet. And they term that type of thinking mind wandering, right? We all do it, and that's okay, right? It's the way our brains are kind of designed and wired. But mindfulness gives us the ability to come back, right? Strengthen our attention and our ability to come back and notice. The more we can do that, right? The more we can just, okay, I'm going to spend 30 seconds washing my hands, feeling the water, smelling the soap, witnessing the bubbles, whatever, really bring yourself into that moment. And again, the helpful thing about this is it's just tied to something you already do every day. So find, one or two things that you do every day, whether it's walking your dog or, something at work, eating breakfast, drinking your coffee, and try to spend 30 seconds of that activity in a noticing space, noticing, your senses, noticing what's going on in your body, in your mind, just really being in that kind of curious noticing place. And that will be a very easy mindful practice that really can be, done over and over again. So optimistic thinking is another way of reframing, and optimistic thinking is actually a pretty well-researched concept in positive psychology, in that we often think about optimism and pessimism as character traits that people have or don't have, but actually what we've identified is that it's a way of thinking, and in fact, a specific way of explaining why the good and the bad events happen. And so you can use an optimistic explanatory style, or you can use a pessimistic explanatory style. And this is talked about. Martin Seligman, who's the founder of positive psychology, identified the 3 P's of optimistic thinking. So it's personalization, pervasiveness, and permanence. And they're really critical to how we bounce back and are resilient in the face of hardship. So if you think about the personalization, right? This belief that either, things are all your fault, right? That would be kind of something that would be this pessimistic way of thinking. Pervasiveness, right? Oops, sorry. But personalization in terms of being resilient would be that, not everything happens because of you. So you don't take it all to blame, that there are other things to consider. The pervasiveness, right? Just thinking about when one thing happens in one area of your life, we often kind of catastrophize and kind of think about this one setback impacting every other space. And so it's really thinking about that you're not bad at everything you do, or you're not going to fail in every aspect, right, of your partnership, your, relationships, your other parts of your job, your parenting, your many other facets of your life. And then the permanence. So the belief that, when one bad thing happens, that's it. And that, you kind of have to remind yourself of the fact that they're temporary. So this OPT is how I kind of simplified that, because we want to remember, I want to think with optimism. So when you face a setback or failure, you're going to say, I want to, respond with optimism. So I'm going to remember, okay, other causes. This isn't just for me to shoulder all the blame, that there are other factors at play, other causes. P, this is a particular situation. So this is not pervasive. It doesn't impact, all the aspects of my life, but this is a particular situation. And then T, temporary, that, this too shall pass, right? This emotion, this moment, this failure, setback, challenge is temporary, right? So just remember OPT as a way of kind of reframing and to utilize a more optimistic thinking style in the face of challenge. And then to end today, this idea of relationships, reconnecting, we know that the toll of loneliness is incredibly detrimental to our well-being, to our resilience. And in fact, if there was one thing you were going to change in your life, while I would hope you could take something from those other 2, this one is really, when we look at the human experience, when we look at who we are, what leads to well-being and survival, that we are primed to relate to each other, that we need each other to be able to fully, you know, have all of the chemical reactions that are needed for happiness, for survival, you know, oxytocin, dopamine, that we have really evolved to be in relation with one another, and that we really need each other in order to maximize our well-being and to be resilient. And so just thinking about the many studies that have really shown the impact of relationships in our life, how it impacts our happiness, right, our well-being, and our longevity, right? So it has a physiological impact on our stress response, on our kind of immune system, all of these things that keep us healthy and living kind of this long life that we desire. We also know, unlike some of these other practices and studies, that there's a causal relationship. It's not just correlational, and it's bidirectional. So the more social relationships you have, it actually causes you to be happier, which, because you're happier, the better and stronger your relationships are. So thinking about specific ways we can really focus on what it means to nourish and celebrate the relationships, to really foster this resilient path kind of away from loneliness towards more connection. We use this acronym of just CONNECT, right? Remembering compassion both for others and ourselves, and how compassion plays a role in our ability to connect. This idea of other people, right? Just keeping in mind, we have such busy lives, work obligations, busy family schedules, and really to make time for that deep connection with other people. Nourishing yourself, your mind, body, that expression of you put on your own oxygen mask, that really taking care of yourself is going to allow you to be better able to connect with those in your life. And again, that will be kind of a causal relationship. Nature, there's really no easier way to help boost your mood than just stepping out in nature, whether it's planting an herb garden on your patio or just going for a little walk and listening to the birds. Research shows this has a profound impact on your brain and your behavior, and it's really undeniable. So, really make time for that, and you'll notice a huge shift in your mood and your nervous system as well. Engagement, right? How we engage, really thinking about activities and how we can get involved and focused in play, right? What are you doing with each other? Maybe it's going for a walk. Maybe it's playing, kickball with your family. Maybe it's in the workplace where you're having lunch together and allowing for opportunities to really share stories. How are you really fully engaging, getting creative, and then finally experiencing gratitude, right? Remembering that our brains are wired for survival, so they are always hunting for what's wrong around us to keep us alive. We need to intentionally engage in gratitude for what we have, right, rather than what we lack, in order to kind of release that dopamine, allow us to see the good in other people, create relationships that are based on what's right as opposed to what's wrong. And then finally, to end for today, there's something called active constructive responding. And this is really about how we react to good news. And so as a way of thinking about, okay, what's one thing I can do to begin to cultivate kind of stronger, more trusting, deeper relationships with the people in my life that are going to be allow for more resilience, think about how you respond when they share good news. And what you want to do is really engage in this active, constructive responding. So rather than say, oh, cool, that's great, or, oh, sounds good, or whatever it may be, these kind of ways we kind of are in our automatic pilot, we may not be focused. When somebody shares good news with you, be really intentional about celebrating it, getting curious, asking questions, and building on that. Not only will they feel better, but what we find is it builds trust between two people. They feel kind of heard and acknowledged, and you also have an opportunity because of that interaction to engage in a more beneficial way to your well-being. And so we have a couple minutes left. We talked about kind of relaxing techniques, things to activate the vagus nerve, to increase our vagal tone, to allow us to, be less reactive and more responsive. Mindfulness is another way of optimizing kind of how we reframe situations, developing that OPT, right? Remembering other causes, it's temporary. Oh, sorry, it's now I'm not going to remember. Pervasiveness, particular, sorry. It's particular, right? It's not pervasive, and then temporary. And then other people matter, really engaging and relying on cultivating these relationships and making time and space to do that. And so I don't know if there have been any questions that have come up in the chat. Feel free to type them in. I'll take a look right now. And if not, feel free to unmute yourself if you have a thought or question, or you can use the chat as well.
Delvina, this was terrific. This is Ginger. I'm a yoga instructor, so a lot of these things were familiar to me, but it's always good to have a reminder. And for those that it was new to, it's really great to learn these techniques because WIC clinics are busy and they do need to do some self-care. So thanks for sharing this stuff today. I'm not seeing any questions in the chat or any hands raised. We will get this posted on the YouTube if you want to look at it again and go through some of the techniques or share with a coworker. I guess so. Thanks for joining us, Delvina. There aren't any questions. I very much enjoyed this. Thank you. Thank you, Connie, for chatting, for sharing. Tasha says, thank you for this. I didn't realize it was the exhale that had the greatest impact. Finding this content personally relevant. Yes, Tasha, exactly. Exactly. Carol says, thank you. This is one of the best trainings I've attended. Thank you. Thank you, Krista, Jill, Jen Vijay. Thank you. Oh, lots of people. Erica, Jen Kern, Mariah say thank you. Yeah, these techniques are great for us. So we do appreciate it. Do you think you'd be able to email the PowerPoint and then we could share it in weekly updates, Sam, if people wanted to look at the techniques just through the PowerPoint? I think that
I
would
have
be
a
great.
follow-up resource that I'll send that has the techniques and like additional kind of books or websites or apps that anybody can explore too. So I'll send that resource and that will provide all information.
Wonderful. Okay. So some more thank yous, but no questions. So it is 12, trying to be mindful of people's clinic schedule. Thank you all really so much for joining us. Thanks Sam and Carrie and Kyle for joining from State Office, April. And Delvina, thank you so much for sharing this content with us today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Take care, everyone.
Take care. Thank you. Enjoy lunch, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day.